Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today we're out at the West Shore Sportsmen's Association, and today we're going to be starting a new series here on the channel. And this will be a periodic series, so every now and then you're going to be seeing one of these, and it's going to be on the iconic revolvers of the 20th century. Now, back when I started reading gun magazines, really back in the 1960s, there were some typical, let's say, ersatz competitions set up by gun writers. What's best? Colt or Smith & Wesson revolvers? What's best? Semi-automatics or revolvers? You know, are single actions still relevant? All of those things. Well, largely those have gone by the wayside now, because there's no doubt that on the question of what should you carry, a semi-automatic or a revolver, semi-automatics have won the day. Not to say that revolvers aren't still relevant, but let's face it, whether it's military, police, or civilian carry, most people are carrying semi-automatic revolvers today. But for most of the 20th century, that was not the case. And since we're now almost a full quarter through the 21st century, I feel that the 20th century is fair game for history. So in this series, we're going to look at those revolvers that we used in the 20th century, and we're going to look at the ones that were really iconic. And for the first episode of this series, we're going to be looking at Colt's Official Police revolver, one of the most popular revolvers of the entire 20th century. You know, since I've lived most of my life in the 20th century, it's hard for me to think of that century as something you'd encounter in history class. But you know, I have to admit that the 21st century is a quarter gone by. So even though for me the 20th century feels more like current events, it definitely is the stuff of history. And I think that makes it a legitimate subject for this channel. Now, as British writer Leslie Poles Hartley said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." But one of the things that we did differently in the 20th century was our choice of handguns. Now, I think there's really no argument that today semi-automatic handguns rule the roost. In all segments, whether it's military, police, civilian self-defense, civilian target shooting, you will find semi-automatics as the number one choice of most of the shooting public. But that wasn't the case in the 20th century. In the 20th century, for most of it, until really the 1980s, the predominant choice in the civilian marketplace was double-action revolvers. Now, granted, the military had gone to semi-automatic revolvers by 1911, quite early on. But here in America, civilian shooters typically don't take their cues from the military. They take them from police. And police overwhelmingly used the double-action, solid-frame, swing-out cylinder revolver. So, in our look at iconic revolvers of the 20th century, I'm going to take a look first at the revolver that the police chose overwhelmingly in the first half of the 20th century. And that's Colt's Official Police revolver. Now, the Colt Official Police revolver was first marketed in 1927, but it didn't just spring into the marketplace out of nowhere. The basic design of the Official Police made its debut in 1889. That was when Colt was the first company to produce a double-action revolver with a solid frame and a swing-out cylinder. Well, for those of you who aren't really familiar with revolvers, you might wonder what I mean when I say a solid frame swing-out cylinder revolver. And in the early age of cartridge revolvers, you basically had two types. You had solid frame revolvers that loaded through a loading gate, one at a time, and ejected through the loading gate pretty much one at a time, like the Colt Single Action Army. And then you had break top, or top break revolvers, like the Schofield and like many Smith & Wessons until really the end of the 19th century. So Colt developed something that was very unique. It was a solid frame revolver, which was stronger than a top break revolver. And by solid frame, I mean the frame had no hinge, right? It was all together. Solid top strap for strength, everything's fine. But swing out cylinder meant by pulling this latch, you could swing the cylinder out and simultaneously eject all of the cartridges. So it was much faster to load and unload. Now at the time, of course, they loaded one at a time. And in the more modern era, we've got speed loaders where we can just drop them right in. And that was one of the great innovations that Colt made to the revolver that really made the modern double actions of the 20th century possible. As I said, Colt did this in 1889. Smith & Wesson wouldn't put out their first version of a solid frame swing-out cylinder revolver for another 7 years. So at first, this solid frame swing-out cylinder design competed with top break designs of double action revolvers, which had come before it, of course. But eventually, the superiority of the solid frame swing-out cylinder design made itself evident. And it basically drove all other designs out of the marketplace. The only place where top breaks really maintained a foothold was in Great Britain with the Webley revolvers, their military revolvers. Certainly in America, the swing-out cylinder revolver was the gun of the 20th century. Now, the original swing-out cylinder revolver guns, both from Colt and Smith & Wesson, were chambered for the .38 Long Colt cartridge. And the problem with the .38 Long Colt cartridge is that it is essentially the exact same load as the cap and ball Colt 1851 Navy revolver. All they did was change that from a paper cartridge to a self-contained brass cartridge, and on they went. And that's because the first cartridge revolvers, particularly out of Colt, were conversions of their cap and ball revolvers to centerfire or rimfire. So quite naturally, they developed their cartridges from their cap and ball cartridges. Right? Now that perpetuated itself through most of the 19th century. You know, results were acceptable until you got into real combat. Because of course, during the Indian Wars, the .45 Colt and the .45 Schofield single action revolvers were the predominant sidearms. By the time the double action Army model came along in 1889, the Indian Wars were largely over. So the next war on the horizon for us was the Spanish-American War. And the .38 Long Colt performed adequately in Cuba. But in the Philippines, during the Philippine insurrection, it was a different story. Trying to fight Moro tribesmen when they were in a frenzy, our soldiers just found that the .38 Long Colt didn't stop them. You could riddle them with 6 .38 Long Colts and they would still get to you and kill you with a sword. Not a good situation. But because of that, the Army reissued, pulled out of storage, out of mothballs, single action Army revolvers, and they bought up a bunch of Colt 1878 double action .45 Colt revolvers and put those in service, and they seemed to do the trick. So the Army was looking for a more powerful cartridge, and Smith & Wesson tried to give them one without really changing the game that much. And what they did is they elongated the case of the .38 Long Colt by about 1/10 of an inch. And they raised the powder charge from 18 grains to 21 grains of powder, which gave them about 100 feet per second more velocity. Really, it was a marginal change. But within 2 years, the .38 Special had become a smokeless powder cartridge, and its power increased tremendously. when you load it with smokeless powder. In fact, it can be loaded, as we know now, with pressures up to 357 Magnum. Whether the guns could handle it or not, that's a story that'll come along later. But the 38 Special very quickly became the cartridge of choice in both the police and civilian marketplace. And prior to that, the main police cartridge had been the 32 Smith & Wesson Long. And for most of the 19th century, 32 caliber guns were considered plenty good enough for police use. I mean, these days we would think of that as woefully underpowered. But I think the fact is, nobody likes to get shot. They don't want to get shot with a 32 any more than they want to get shot with a 45. And that will stop most criminals, except the most determined ones. And the most determined ones, you're going to have trouble putting down with a 44 Magnum. So, maybe they were not so far off in their thinking. So, by the turn of the 20th century, many police departments were putting away their Colt 32 caliber police positive revolvers and going to larger 38s, whether the 38 Smith & Wesson or more commonly the 38 Special, which was seen as kind of the high-powered revolver of the day. So to capitalize on that market, Colt upsized the frame of the police positive a little bit to a 38 caliber frame from a 32 caliber frame. They kept the 32 caliber, but they made the police positive 38, chambered in 38 Colt, and they did a pretty 38 Special, pardon me. The Colt police positive chambered in 38 Special, and they did a pretty brisk business. But there were shooters looking for a stronger gun. The 38 police positive is a fairly small framed gun. It's light, it's handy, but it's not going to handle really high pressure loads. So to capitalize on that trend of police looking for more powerful guns, Colt introduced a modernized medium frame revolver in 1908. And this gun was built on their 41 caliber frame. So a little bit larger frame than the frame used in the police positive 38, but still chambered for 38 Special. It was also chambered for 41 Colt, 32-20, 22 rimfire. By building it on the 41 caliber frame, they made a revolver that was stronger than their closest competitor, which was the Smith & Wesson Military and Police, now known as the Model 10. And they went head-to-head for most of the century, Smith and Wesson and Colt on those two models. But that gun that came out in 1909 was very popular with police. And to capitalize on that, in 1927, to the Colt Official Police, which was just a marketing tour de force. And it ended up being the dominant double-action revolver for the first half of the 20th century. When they changed the name to the Official Police, Colt made a few tweaks to the design. They grooved the trigger for a better purchase. And to be honest with you, most shooters today would find that to be not a good design change. Because in double action mode, a smooth trigger really works better on your finger. But as you're going to see, the doctrine for police in the 1900 up until about 1950 was to fire those double action revolvers single action whenever possible. And the groove trigger gave you a better controlled single action break. And that's why they did it. Back then, the doctrine was to only shoot in double action if you were basically in a scuffle with the bad guy. By the late 1920s, American gangsters were operating interstate crime sprees. I mean, Bonnie and Clyde comes to mind, of course, but you had a lot of famous gangsters then, Machine Gun Kelly, Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger, and many less famous than that, who were using their cars to move long distances between crime scenes to evade the police. And cars then were made out of pretty heavy gauge sheet iron. So a typical .38 special bullet was not getting through the door, and it certainly was not going to bust the engine block. So police were asking for more powerful rounds. And Colt responded with their 1911 by developing the .38 Super, .38 Super Plus P, which was just a .38 ACP hopped up on steroids. And the bad thing was, it was shooting guns chambered for .38 ACP, but it was basically a .357 Magnum pressured round. So that, with full metal jacketed bullets, would punch right through door steel, and it could crack an engine block. And a lot of agents, federal agents particularly, favored it. Now on the revolver side, Smith & Wesson developed a new round called the .38-44. And basically what they did is they took a .44 caliber handgun frame and they chambered it for .38 special. So they took their end frame and bored .38 special holes in it. And that became the .38-44 revolver. Later it was the highway patrol model. There are two models of the end frame, a fancy model and a more plain model. But the beauty of that is it could handle this hopped up .38-44 ammunition, which was basically loaded to the pressures of .357 Magnum. And the Smith & Wesson military and police K-frame was not strong enough to handle that ammunition. It'll go, big heavy gun. Now, Colt came along and said, hey, you know, we like the .38-44 rounds, but it just so happens that because we made the official police on a .41 caliber frame, it has the strength to handle .38-44 rounds just as it is. And that was a big marketing point for them. So you could shoot those high pressure, basically .38 special plus P to .38 to .357 Magnum pressured rounds, and some of those .38-44s were really loaded hot in the official police, which is why I have never worried about shooting plus P rounds in my official police, even though theoretically it's not officially rated for them. But if it could handle .38-44 rounds, 38 special plus P are child's play for it. So, but that was the police response to these interstate gangsters with their heavy automobiles in the 1920s and 1930s. By 1933, many police departments had adopted the Colt Official Police as their official sidearm. At the time, the New York City Police, the Los Angeles Police, the Chicago City Police Force, as well as many state and highway patrols, were all using the Colt Official Police. And a lot of smaller departments took their cues right from them. In fact, here in Pennsylvania, the official police was the gun of the highway patrol for most of the century. In 1940 and 1941, about 50,000 Colt Official Police were purchased by Great Britain for British Armed Forces because they did not have enough Webleys and Enfields to go around. Here in the U.S., the Army tried to stick to .45 ACP guns as their primary service weapons, whether it was the 1911 or the supplemental revolvers they used, which were Smith & Wesson and Colt's Model 1917, which shot .45 ACP in half-moon clips. But there really were not enough of those handguns to go around. So the Army armed people here on the home front, security guards, base guards, that sort of thing, with official police revolvers. They were a very big choice with security personnel during World War II. The only problem with the official police as far as the government was concerned was that the cost was too high during the war and for the amount they had to buy. So to reduce the cost, Colt did not finish the Wartime Official Police as well. They didn't do as good a polishing job. They didn't do the royal blue. They didn't use walnut grips. They used what they call Colt wood grips, which were plastic grip stocks. So all that was an effort to reduce the cost of the guns to the government. These guns were dubbed the Colt Commando, and they're straight up official police, but they're most recognized because they're Parkerized finish. Most of them have uncheckered walnut or plastic grips, and just in general would not exhibit the standards of fit and finish that you would have expected to see in an interwar gun, a gun made between the two world wars. After World War II, Colt returned to commercial production of the official police, and they returned to a properly polished and properly blued version of the gun, though they kept the plastic grips for the first few years, and my suspicion is because they had bought so many of them during wartime, they just wanted to use them up. If you're like me and you've got one of those early 50s Colts, I got a pair of aftermarket official police grips in very nice walnut checkered, and I find those to be much better than the plastic stocks. The only other real changes on the post-war model was that the checkering was removed from the cylinder latch, and that the hammer spur, instead of being checkered, was just grooved. So other than that, pre-war, post-war, very much the same in terms of the features of the gun. Not only were building revolvers like the official police expensive, but by the late 1950s, Colt's highly skilled workforce, which is what was required because the action parts required a lot of hand fitting to make the actions run smoothly. And the workforce that was doing that by the late 1950s was reaching retirement age, and they were leaving. And Colt was finding it very difficult to replace them with new workers. And when they did replace them, they found they did not have years to train them the way their predecessors had been trained as they came on, here and there. That they needed them to be effective gunsmiths now. And the result was that quality suffered at Colt. And the other thing that Colt suffered from, besides they had economic problems, they had pricing issues, they had quality issues, and they also ran into training changes or doctrine changes in the way police officers engaged with their revolvers. So, as I told you, for most of the century, they were fired single action. In fact, in the 1932 edition of the Manual of Police Revolver Instruction, it states, quote, "The revolver should be fired single action. That is to cock the hammer between each shot. Firing double action is to cock the hammer by increasing the pressure of the trigger finger on the trigger, which lifts the hammer until it is released by the end of the strut. The revolver should only be fired by this method, double action, in an emergency, when the hammer cannot be cocked by the thumb, or when in very close proximity to the adversary, such as a hand-to-hand scuffle." So as I said, the police training doctrine for the first half of the 20th century was to shoot these double-action revolvers in single-action mode whenever you could. That you should only shoot double action, basically if you were in contact distance with the bad guy, if you were engaged in a scuffle. Otherwise, single action was it. There's always got to be one, huh? Well, by the 1960s, most police forces, and federal agencies were teaching a whole different doctrine of engaging with a handgun. And it required double action shooting almost exclusively. The FBI really took the lead in this. And if you ever look at the FBI training from the 50s and the 60s, it is all deep crouch, fast draw, one-handed double action shooting. Now, in the second half of the century, the training doctrine switched to double action fire. But it was still one-handed shooting. I mean, even the FBI taught shooting one-handed from a deep crouch. Double action. Which obviously can be done. Yep, there's always one. And a lot of officers found the triggers, double action triggers, on the Smith & Wesson Model 10, the old military and police, to be superior for double action shooting than the Colt Official Police trigger, which they felt stacked too much at the end, making it almost like a two-stage. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I have both. I've got a vintage Official Police and I have vintage Model 10s. And the triggers feel equally good on both of them. I mean, my Official Police, this is loaded with dummies right now, does not stack. It is smooth as glass. I can hit as well with this double action as I can single action. But not everybody felt that way, and probably with the quality issues Colt was experiencing as they tried to train up a new workforce, well, they may not have been as good. And Smith & Wesson Model 10 began to be the gun of choice if you had a choice. And a lot of departments allowed their officers to arm themselves with either an Official Police in 38 Special or a Smith & Wesson Model 10 in 38 Special. And by the 1960s, the decision was going in favor of the Smith & Wesson Model 10. So by the time we get to the 70s, Colt was looking to replace the Official Police, which it did. But it's still an iconic revolver of the 20th century. And over 400,000 Official Police were made, which means there are quite a few available on the used market. And if you can get one, they are absolutely a solid revolver. You can own a piece of history. And they're fully functional. I mean, my gun, my youngest Official Police, is 75 years old, almost, and it still acts like a 20-year-old. Yeah, it's still a wonderful gun to shoot, and in fact, if I'm just picking a gun for plinking at the range, most often it's going to be the Official Police. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this look at one of the 20th century's most iconic revolvers. We'll follow this up. Next will probably be a look at that Smith & Wesson Model 10 I've been talking about as its main competitor. And then we'll tackle some of the others as time goes on. So until next time, bye.